Welcome, my friends, to Peace, Love, and Bring It Back, the podcast that never ends, where we gather our clan and talk about the peace and love in our lives, the difficulties along the journey, and how we rise up from them. We will experience a little thing I call Kluberty together, and by the end of the show, we're going to find our sweet spot. I'm Uncle Dave, and our transformation starts right here. Hey now, and how are you doing? I want to welcome you to the next episode of Peace, Love, and Bring a Bat. Today we have an amazing author, philanthropist. I can't wait to talk to Traci Medford-Rosow. How you doing this morning, Traci?
Very well. And you?
I'm doing well. Life is good. Keep moving on our path. You and I have talked about being on our paths. And so right now, your path is to come out with your third book, and the book called Unsheltered. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, it's a story of what happened during the early months of the pandemic in New York City. So my husband and I were in Turks, actually on vacation, when we got the news that the borders were closing and we had to come back to the country. And so we ended up in New York City, which is where we live. And we walked into it's very hard to describe what New York City was like in 2020 in the early days of the pandemic, but it was, it sort of resembled a war zone because there were no people and everything was boarded up. So I think it was that very first night that we got back, I looked out the window and I noticed that the streets of New York City were just completely and totally deserted. It's almost impossible to believe, unless you lived through it, what New York City was like during that first year of the pandemic, pretty much for most of 2020. There was just nobody to be seen. And the people that were still living there, like us, really didn't go out that much except to go to the grocery store, to the pharmacy, stuff like that. People were sheltering in place. But what I did notice, and what I noticed for the first time in my life, was that the homeless people were still on the streets. And I was watching them, and it occurred to me that, you know, where were they going to shelter in place? But what didn't occur to me until a few days later was that they were starving. And because they depended on eating pretty much from getting the panhandling activity, or being able to go to the different places that, you know, offer food and stuff, but everything was shut. So the next day I went out to the grocery store and I noticed them again. It was the only thing that was, visible, the only people that were visible. And I said to Joel, my husband, that I think we need to try and do something. So we weren't homeless advocates at that point. We didn't know really much about homeless people. And I hadn't, to be honest, really noticed how many homeless people there are in New York City until they became obvious because of the lack of any other people. So we just started the next day, which was March 19th. We returned to New York City on March 18th, 2020, walking the city streets, handing out a few dollars to the homeless people that we met. And that quickly turned into realizing that we needed to start making food, because there really was no food. And the animals were also starving, which was an interesting and sad thing to see, because animals in New York City aren't wild. Are domesticated, but they're not actually wild. They're very dependent on the food droppings, that we drop food, when we eat outside, when we're walking along on the sidewalks. So I really noticed that the birds and the squirrels in particular were starving, but so were the homeless people. So we set out on this journey that lasted, well, we're still in it. So it's 2.5 years now that we're now involved with the homeless people in New York City. But in those early days, all we did was get up every morning and make food, and then just walk the streets till we couldn't walk anymore. And at some point, I started to really understand a little bit about the psychology of homelessness and what led people into that very unfortunate fate. And I started taking notes, keeping a journal. And then I wrote the third book, which is called Unsheltered Love, Homelessness, Hunger, and Hope in a City Under Siege. Yeah,
most of us are really just, one or two paychecks away from being homeless. If we think about it, there's not everybody has those savings, and it's very easy for those things to happen to us.
It really is. I lost a few good friends during the pandemic not from COVID actually, but just from the financial stress of not being able to make ends meet. And that unfortunately resulted in their deaths, which is also in the book. But the book is primarily about the homeless people we met and their individual journeys. And I sort of centered on maybe 10 different people so that there wouldn't be too many characters in the book. And one of the women in particular, who's actually a friend of mine at this point, she wrote she has an entry in the book after each chapter so that you sort of see the situation from, if you will, both ends of the sidewalk. You know, she was living on it and I was walking them. But so the story is told from this perspective of me and a homeless woman who writes under the pen name of Maggie Wright. So that it's an interesting sort of juxtaposition of the viewpoints of two very different women, one homeless, one, fortunate woman who was still, I was able to work through the pandemic. I have, after working, in corporate America for many, many years, I opened a law firm with my partner. And so we were still able to work. And I became very aware that how fortunate I was that I was able to work on Zoom. And so many people, the homeless were obviously very badly affected, but so were the waiters in New York City, the hairstylists, the manicurists, all the people who were dependent on being able to work face to face in order to earn money. And not everybody can work on Zoom. And so I became very, very aware of how lucky I was and also how difficult it was for the people to survive the pandemic who couldn't work the way I was still able to work. So
yeah, that's been a blessing, for people who like myself as well, who are able to work through it and not have to think about it. The pivot was really, really easy, especially because I had been working from home at times. So now it was even better. I had always said I love my job. The commute was always the rough part, being in my, I guess, privileged way of looking at it. But, the things that you're bringing up, I hadn't even thought about how the whole food chain, right? So, we're all on the food chain, including the animals who then weren't able to go to the garbage bins, as well as the people who are unfortunately go to the garbage bins. So, want to hear
Right. So I became, very acutely aware of sort of the financial hardship of the people that weren't able to work the way we can work and that were really dependent on being able to go to work. And as much as, the government did what they could in terms of the stimulus checks and the unemployment and all, it was still very difficult for them. And I lived right in the middle of Midtown Manhattan. So I really saw how the people were suffering who just couldn't work, and it went on for a pretty long time before, even the restaurants were able to open finally for outdoor eating only. But even at that point, there were still so many people that were nervous to go out. And so, most of the outdoor venues were still empty and it was a struggle for everybody, but
I can't remember it. Those first year I was by myself a lot, so I volunteered to deliver food through a charity here on Long Island, and driving around at 5 o'clock to make sure people had meals and not interacting with anybody, but there was nobody on the road. I can't imagine what the city was. I mean, I've been in the city during the blackout and 9/11. 9/11 was also one of those real times when there's nobody on the street and everybody was as quiet as a pin. But I can't imagine nobody walking out. We were all afraid at that time to get out of our own homes. And if you were lucky enough to be, not be homeless. And
right, exactly. No, everybody was afraid. Well, we were afraid too, walking the streets and interacting with the homeless. But I just didn't feel like we had any choice because as I looked out my window and saw people starving, I just said to my husband, Joel, I said, well, we have two choices. We can stay here and shelter in place and order food in, Fresh Direct delivers, the grocery stores deliver, maybe slip down to the grocery store every now and then, or we could make food and go out and take our chances. And we're both, you know, I mean, Joel is 71 and I'm 67, so we're not young. And you know, it was clear that the virus was more dangerous the older you got. And so it wasn't that we weren't carefree about it, but neither one of us really felt like that we had a choice. And it was a very transformative experience for me because something very odd happened in the midst of what we were doing, which is that I realized I was very happy. And I realized I was probably the happiest I've ever been in my entire life. I was absolutely at peace. And I couldn't quite understand what was happening to me, because how could I be happy? You know, I was in the middle of a pandemic, in the middle of New York City. I wasn't able to see, you know, even my own children, much less any of my friends. There was nothing open. There was suffering everywhere you looked. There was some form of suffering, right down to the animals. But I was in total peace for the first time in my life. I felt absolutely at peace. And I started to realize that what was happening to me was that I just wasn't thinking at all about Traci. There was no time, no bandwidth to think about Traci, even in the most basic needs. Like I have hundreds and hundreds of pictures, and I see that all the pictures that I have with the homeless people, I've just got, you know, I've thrown on a dirty t-shirt, a dirty pair of jeans. You know, my hair isn't washed. There's no makeup on. There's no jewelry. Because I got up and we turned our kitchen into basically a sandwich assembly line. And we just made sandwiches for a long time. And then we set out with these big bags. There was no time for me to think about myself. And I as I look back on that period in time, I think that was probably the reason I was so at peace and so happy, was I just wasn't thinking about myself. Even basic things like, you know, washing my hair. I mean, I did obviously take showers, but it wasn't a priority, you know, to get myself the way I would do if I was going to go to work, for example. I just was out on the street trying to get food into people who were starving.
Yeah, I mean, that's really incredible, and I know you long enough to know your heart. To, you know, that quick pivot that you started seeing that right away,
very quickly.
Yeah, you know, just noticing it. I mean, especially living in Midtown, you know, it's a bustling area, and how it just stops. It makes you notice that much more. I remember those days driving around, and it wasn't just my neighborhood. They would ask me, can I drive here? Can I drive there? So I got a good taste of the South Shore of Long Island, and just dropping at people's houses, not interacting. And then, you know, these people who were fearful because of either medical conditions or other, you know, age and all these things. And that you were doing that at an age when they were telling older people, not that you're old. I mean, you're in good shape. You and Joel keep yourselves in really good shape. But that's still, we didn't know a lot at that beginning.
Right. So, yeah, I don't think I knew what was happening at first. It wasn't until after I really started writing the book and trying to put down the whole picture of what was happening. So the book sort of has two literary arcs. One is what was happening in New York City in the height of the pandemic, and then also what was happening to the homeless people during that time. I don't think I could have explained what was happening to me at that time. I don't think I even was that aware of how happy I was until later, when it started to wear off, when life started to resume. And then I started to think about something other than everybody else. And I started to return to, quote, my normal life. And I realized, well, I'm not as happy as I was. I'm not as at peace as I was. So it was kind of it was a pivot for me to just realize that the less I thought about Traci, the happier I was.
And that's the magic of when you're helping people. You know, I know that the biggest things that happen to me is most of the time is when I'm helping somebody else or doing for others, because we know we that's where the love flows freely out of us. And then usually it's tough for us to look internally to see that love or to even allow us to have our love for ourselves. But you've always shared and cared for so many people. I mean, we've already spoken to Kevin at the beginning, in your other book, Unblinded, and the noticing, your ability to notice and care for people is one of your many gifts. And so, with this book, Unsheltered, how did you meet the other writer, the other character in the book?
So Unsheltered Love, I want the other writer. Her pen name is Maggie Wright, Wright, was one of the people that we befriended, one of the homeless people that we befriended. And she lived on the corner of Park Avenue and 30th Street for 3 years with her partner. And somewhat, maybe a month into what Joel and I were doing, we said we should really concentrate on a smaller area of the city, because at first we were just walking all over. And we were spreading ourselves very thin and not really helping that many, not doing that much good. So we said, there are a lot of people on Park Avenue. We live just off of Park Avenue in Murray Hill. And so we set out in a southern direction down Park Avenue. We walked down to Union Square, which is at 14th Street, and back up. And we sort of concentrated on that 26 blocks of Park Avenue. And Maggie was living on the corner of Park Avenue and 30th Street. So every day I would pass by her, and every day I would stop, and we would, give her some food and a few dollars. And then little by little, she started talking to me and sharing with me her story. She's a 40-year-old white Jewish woman, very smart, has 2 children. Her parents are both retired teachers. She was brought up on Long Island in a nice area, and she became homeless as a result of having a root canal. So she was married, and she got an emergency root canal, and she got her first opioid prescription. I don't remember which one it was, but it was one of those. And she became addicted very quickly. And that led to, a whole series of unfortunate incidents, which are chronicled in her story. And then eventually she tried to get off of the opioids. So she started drinking vodka, and she became an alcoholic. And then she was living at the time with her husband's parents. And then it was sort of, I guess, agreed that it wasn't really working out. She needed to move out. So she did. And she had an apartment. She had a good job at the time. She was the director of a nursery school where she lived. But she continued to drink, and things went downhill pretty fast, and she ended up homeless. So I met her on the street. And then here we are 2.5 years later, and we have a book that's getting ready to be published a month from now. And she's sheltered, and she's clean, and she's back in college.
Awesome. Yeah. It's great. I mean, being a warrior, recovering for a lot. And that's, the 2 things I want people to notice. One, we were talking about Park Avenue. People are living on Park Avenue, right? Which is almost, ironic, because there's so much wealth of people who live on, Park Avenue, and that there are so many homeless there presently, as well as definitely during the pandemic. And, we can't always think that they're just not in our neighborhood. And that's one of the things that I noticed that you and Joel always have done and paid attention to the people in your neighborhood. And that's the most important part. When we talk about charity work, I always talk about Frank Shankowitz, who created the Make-A-Wish Foundation. And through his life, he's always said, everybody could do something. And it's just that moving that dial a little bit. It might not move a dial, but think about that person who you're assisting. We'll be back in a moment.
Well, that's a nice song. Hey, everybody. It's me, the launch dad himself, George Andriopoulos, the host of the Launchcast, the co-host of Over My Dad podcast. But more importantly, I'm here today on behalf of Launchpad 516 Studios, the podcast production company that makes those two shows, the one you're listening to now, and so many others possible. Now, what is Launchpad 516 Studios? Well, it's the brainchild of Launchpad 516. It's a podcast production company, and we help you from conceptualization to production to recording to post-production to monetization. The key word here, let's turn that hobby, that idea into a revenue stream. But more importantly, let's get that important idea out there and get your voice heard, because that's what matters right now. Hit us up, launchpad516studios.com to find out more information, or send us an email, podcast@lp516.com. DM me at LaunchpadCEO on all the platforms. Let's chat. Let's get your voice heard. We're pretty good at this, guys. Don't let this offer slip by you. Later, guys.
You're listening to Peace, Love, and Bring It Back with me, Uncle Dave Shemetsky. So I know that I also want to let you talk about that the proceeds, all the proceeds for this book are going to a shelter, again, showing the bigness of your heart. So could you share that with us?
Yes. So the organization is Hand in Hand by Glenn. It's a nonprofit organization in Georgia, and they build tiny houses, which is what I've come to believe through my 2.5 years now involvement with the homeless people it's a very good thing to be able to do. The shelter system is broken. I don't think people really realize that. I certainly didn't, but the shelter system is difficult for them, which is why a lot of them prefer actually to live on the streets, because they don't feel safe in shelters. There's, things get stolen. There's continuous fights. And so the shelter system isn't the answer. Mm-hmm. But what does appear to be very helpful are what we call SR, single room occupancy units. And so this organization in Georgia has built a community of 60 tiny homes, and there is an entire group of homeless people living in this community in Georgia. They have food is provided, services are provided. They try to help them get jobs and to basically reintegrate into society, as Maggie has done. It's very difficult. I just can't even put into words how difficult it is for a homeless person to reintegrate into society once they've sort of, dropped. I have this expression, they've dropped through the cracks in the sidewalk, figuratively and almost literally. It's a whole psychology, which I'm still trying to understand through my relationship with Maggie, what really binds a person to this fate once they enter it. Because you would think that anybody given the opportunity to not be homeless would just jump on that, but that's not the case. They become very injured in many, many different ways. And of course, there's alcoholism and drug abuse throughout almost all of them. In fact, all of the people that we met, except for one, is either, challenged by alcohol or drugs or both. But it's far more than just substance abuse. Their whole sense of identity is sort of shattered. Mm-hmm. So I decided to dedicate all the proceeds to this organization in Georgia called Hand in Hand by Glenn. So the nice thing, my publishers also, they're very supportive of trying to help build homes. They donate a portion of their proceeds to Habitat for Humanity. Mm. So when I mentioned this to the publisher, that this is what I wanted to do with the author proceeds from Unsheltered Love, he offered to run a bestseller campaign on the book, August 21st to August 28th, which is basically a lost leader for them, where they sell the ebook for 1 week only for 99 cents. And that hopefully will get the book out there into the hands of many people, because most people will spend 99 cents. And not only that'll hopefully create enough money, to start a nice little donation to Hand in Hand. But more important than that, because you're not going to make that much money, from 99 cents, because everybody, takes a piece of it, but you hopefully get the book out there, and then people will read it and recommend it. And then that will maybe generate, some momentum, so that some significant amount of contributions can be made to Hand in Hand. But we'll see.
Yeah,
it's my third book. You never know.
Yeah, that sounds great. And we'll definitely make sure that this episode gets out the week before, so people know about that that following week. And we'll have the link on it. We'll make sure we have all the links. If you could send me the link, then that would be great. We'll make sure that happens.
Okay, that's great. Thanks.
Yeah, and that's really what it is. I've known you for a while about just always giving back, and you've had a rough life. We're not going to go into that, but you've also, I want to highlight all the giving. I mean, even sharing that story about Kevin and his eyesight, and then being his friend. I mean, being his one of the many people who protect him. I mean, I know that's how we spoke about Kevin,
right.
And then, and then since I've seen you, you've also become a grandma. Is it once or twice?
Twice.
That's what I thought. I thought I saw something. So how beautiful!
Time marches on.
Yes, it does.
Yeah. No, Kevin's story is actually, take a minute to just talk about that, because his name is Kevin Coughlin, and he is a man that also lives in New York City, and he lives in our neighborhood, Murray Hill. And my husband noticed him on the streets because he was always walking his seeing eye dog, and Joel was walking our lab. Kevin's dog was a yellow lab, seeing eye dog, and our dog was a yellow lab. And so one day he came home extremely, because it was Easter morning of 2016, and he came charging back into the apartment and said, you know that blind man in our neighborhood? And I said, yeah. He said, well, he can see again. And I was like, oh, wow, that's amazing. Did he, is he on some kind of a drug? Did he have an operation? And he said, no, he just, he just started to be able to see again. So I knew there was a story there, but I didn't think much about it. And a few weeks later, Joel came back and said that Kevin wanted somebody to help him write his story. So I did help him write the story, but he is the first and the only known human being in the world who has regained their sight after 20 years of blindness from this rare genetic disorder that he has, which is called Leber's hereditary optic neuropathy. Unfortunately, what happens with that is a person in their 20s usually just suddenly goes blind. Kevin went from 20/20 vision to totally blind almost overnight. He went to bed one night and he could see, he woke up the next morning and he couldn't. And this is the typical pattern. And then 20 years later, his sight started to come back. And to this day, the medical community has not been able to explain it. He does chronicle in his story, Unblinded, what he did do. Lots of, different things with herbs and this and that. Of course, praying, meditation, and all that stuff. But nobody really knows at this point how his optic nerve regenerated, because the belief is that once the optic nerve dies, or any nerve, it doesn't regenerate. But Kevin's did, and so his story is quite remarkable too.
Yeah, and that's both stories sound incredible. I can't wait to read the new book, and which will be out next week, or it'll be out depending on when people listen to it. But it's really incredible. So what else are you doing? Your path. We talk about our paths, and it's just incredible. What else are you doing besides? I mean, I just want to understand. Let everybody understand. She also is a partner at a law firm. This is not something that's she's just in retirement. I don't know that she knows what that word retirement means, besides taking care of family and writing 3 books. Has won awards. Each well, the new book hasn't been released yet, but the books have won awards. So it's not just I wrote a book and it goes out. It's changing the world. So what else is on your path to help shift the world to make it a better place?
Well, so I spend a lot of time writing. Writing is a very intensive exercise, and I also, as you said, I have a law firm with a man that I used to work with when I was working in corporate America, and we've had this law firm now for maybe 12 years. Mm-hmm. And so there's work to be done there. And then I do have, as you mentioned, 2 grandchildren. My daughter has a 3-year-old, and she just had a baby this summer. So I do help out with that. We have a son as well as a daughter. So we have 2 children and 2 grandchildren. And I also have a foundation called the College Education Milestone Foundation, where we put very high performing students that can't get together the money to go to college. We put them through college, and we've put 44 kids through college now. And that foundation is open to anybody who wants to apply for a scholarship. Again, the 2 things we look for: very good students, but their parents just can't afford to cover all the tuition costs for college. So it's called the College Education Milestone Foundation. So there's time to be spent with that. And that's it.
and that keeps you more than enough busy enough.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, and I guess it's like anything else. You never know what's going to literally walk into your life that you become aware.
Well, that's right. And interestingly enough, I never had on my bucket list to become a writer. I call myself an accidental writer, because I knew when I was 16 years old I wanted to be a lawyer, and I never changed my mind. And I put my mind on that goal and went to college, and I had I majored in political science, and I tried to get good grades because I knew that would be necessary to get into law school. And then I went to law school and started working as a lawyer. And so I guess was admitted to the bar in 1980. So whatever that is, 42 years ago. So I never thought I wanted to be a writer. And the first book just sort of came to me sort of out of thin air. And then so did the second, and so did the third. I wasn't looking really to write books. That wasn't something I wanted to do, but I found it very fulfilling to do that, especially the second and the third book, because Kevin really wanted to tell his story, but he needed somebody to help him write it. And then when I really realized what was happening with the homeless people in New York City, I felt very driven to try and share what I had learned about that situation from the hours and hours and hours that I've spent since March of 2020 interacting with the homeless people in our neighborhood and trying to help. So
as long as I've known you, your voice, and you speak up for the voice of others as well, and it shows through your book. Your heart shows through both the books that I've read, and that's the most important part. Is that's what you do, and I can't wait to see this book and read the book. And also then to see what else is going to go on. This is always, every time seeing you either on social media or our conversations, it's just always like, what else are you doing? When you moved out of corporate America, you had a restaurant, you were doing a whole bunch of things. And
we did. I had a restaurant for 10 years. That's right.
Yeah.
That unfortunately had to close during the pandemic. Many restaurants didn't make it through the pandemic, and I wasn't involved at the restaurant at the time. I had given my shares to my partner several years before the pandemic hit, because I really didn't have time to be in the restaurant anymore because of trying to work. And then I had, at that point, the second book. And when you publish a book, there's work to do even after you publish it. So I gave all of my restaurant shares to my partner, but unfortunately, the restaurant had to close for an extended period during the pandemic, as all restaurants did, and she wasn't able to keep it. It didn't survive the
I
pandemic.
can't imagine, most restaurants, how they got through it, just by either the skin or they're still digging out. And at some point you have to take that position.
Right. And at least in where I live in Murray Hill in New York City, I would say 50% of the restaurants didn't make it. I mean, restaurants around me that had been there forever. I'm just thinking about all, like, you probably know Scotty's on Lexington Avenue. It's a diner. It must have been there for 40 years or something. It didn't survive. It's very, I understand the restaurant business, having been in it myself, but it's almost impossible to survive because you still have to pay rent, and you have, you're trying to do right by your employees and on, unless you could get some significant governmental assistance. And even then, so at least 50% of the restaurants in Midtown Manhattan have closed. Now things are starting to open, new restaurants are coming and life is coming back, and Midtown Manhattan now resembles pretty much what it was before the pandemic. Not completely, but it's close.
We're really close. I remember this. When I did my TEDx talk, I went into the city the weekend before to meet some other speakers for the TEDx and to practice with them and things like that. And that was the first time I was in the city since March when the world shut down. And driving there, living as a New Yorker, New Yorker all my life, going into the city and then even leaving the city at 5:00 on a Sunday, getting home in 40 minutes is unheard of.
I know.
Even getting out of the city might be unheard of at 40.
Right.
I can't imagine living in the city during that time. And, it's beautiful that you and Joel really did that and knew to keep your physical health up and protection, and knew the science behind it, and to create this book, Unsheltered Love, because that's really what you gave. You gave them actually sheltered love. They became to rely on you, and much like anybody else who assisted during this time, we've grasped at straws, and you've always been that piece of land out in the ocean that people come running to.
Well, thank you.
Okay. Now, I since you're an author, and I'm going to put you on the spot, we have this thing. You and I talk about the path, but also about grounding ourselves. What are some of the things that you do to ground yourself?
Well, certainly writing. Writing requires getting into a meditative state. So I also meditate, and I also pray. And one little trick that I have found that works really well for me is that if I feel myself, coming off center, I think about something that I'm grateful for. So everybody has things that they can think of that they're grateful. It doesn't really matter what it is, but I've noticed that if I start feeling, anxious or I'm getting upset about something, I just shift. I'm like, oh, okay, I see I see Traci, you're thinking about this, you're thinking about that. And I just immediately think about something and it really doesn't matter what it is. There's something about thinking about something you're grateful for that grounds you.
Mm. Yep.
So those would be the main things.
Okay. Those are always great. I mean, it's that keeping that present and grounding yourself. And where I go with this is, you might not realize, or a lot of people don't, that the word earth and heart are the same letters, just rearranged differently.
Oh, yeah.
And I often talk about the R in heart. So what's something that maybe is joyous, or what would be an R that's in your heart? Besides Rosow, of course.
You mean a word that starts with R?
Yeah.
Reflection. I learned this, I think, slowly over time, but the more I just observe, and also observe myself, what's going on in myself, I start to understand myself better, and then other people better, and life better. So I spend a lot of time, what I would say, in my observer self. which is where I'm just observing how I feel, what I'm doing, what I'm saying, and what's going on around me.
Yeah, no, I think that's perfect. Because reflection is one of those big, important parts about what we do. And even when whatever we do, that reflection, that self-reflection, could I do things differently? Could there be an improvement? How do I fine-tune things? How I recalibrate some things? That's great. Thank you so much. And thank you so much for your time. And is there anything else you want to leave us with? Any other messages? I mean, you've given us a lot of things to think about. I know I can't wait for the book to come out. I've said it a few times. And is there anything you'd like to share with us on the way out?
One last parting thing I would maybe encourage is just that when we all, as you alluded to, I had some challenges in my life to overcome. But the more I was able to just look at, rather than be in it, I guess I'm going back to the observer self that I've already shared that piece. But to me, that has been the key for my personal transformation, is that the more time I spend as the observer, as opposed to being wrapped up, getting my knickers twisted up about this or that, even when that happens, if I step out and just, oh, okay, Traci, I see you're getting upset about this, this, or this. Oh, I see, Traci, you're thinking about this, this, or this, obviously something negative. It quickly starts to shift so that I come out of the experience of being wrapped up in whatever it is that's causing me to be upset, and look at it almost outside of myself. And that allows almost a very quick calming down. Yep.
You're taking those moments.
I'm sure I'm sure you spent a lot of time in your observer self.
Yeah, that's how I got through the beginning of COVID. I was going through a lot of challenges, and I doing that, you then realize, if you're honest with yourself, you're able to see the triggers that you have within yourself. Yes. I was in the house by myself, me and the chinchilla, so there was nobody to trigger me, and the things that triggered me, I knew that was the areas where I needed the most healing.
Absolutely. That's absolutely the key. The things that I call them pings, and the things that ping a person are the areas that need attention, because life is very reflective, and so we tend to think that, oh, if only this would happen, that would happen. Try to fix things from the outside, but it's much easier actually to fix things from the inside, because everything that's happening to us, everything that we experience and see, is really a reflection of our own state of consciousness at any given point of time, which of course is primarily, associated with our thoughts and what we're doing and what we're saying. That's why when you're helping others, you're really in sort of a energy zone that's very positive. Yep.
No, and that's how it is. Yeah, and you feel so much better when you're in that zone. Nothing could stop you. I was never comfortable sitting in my house alone, and now I sort of enjoy it. I understand it. I remember one time you telling me about your children going through those teenage years, and I always think about you. I'm like, all right, I can get through this. Somehow I'm going to get through this. But it's all good. And that is that reflective zone. So thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
And, I can't wait to read the book, and we'll put all the things in the notes, both charities in the notes. So that way anybody wants to do it. You're one of those goons for good when I talk about people who are doing, I always know somebody. If you want to help somebody, there's a million people who know or are doing those things. And thank you for doing those things. And thank you for showing up today.
Thank you. Thank you so much. It was really nice to see you again.
Yeah, it was great seeing you. And for everybody else, just make sure that you find peace and love in your life. And when you do, bring a bat. But remember, that's bringing an awesome thought, doing something awesome, and swing and hit your sweet spot and knock it out of the park. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm really glad that you're enjoying our show. Peace, Love, and Bring a Bat is brought to you by Launchpad 516 Studios. Executive produced by David Chemetsky and George Andriopoulos. Music selections by James Grant, Zach Nelson, and James Gaither, and licensed through Storyblock. Sound effects and sponsorship music licensed through Epidemic Sound. Peace, Love, and Bring a Bat is hosted with Podbean. Subscribe to our show wherever podcasts are available. And don't forget to leave us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts and share with all of your friends. Follow us on Facebook at Peace, Love, and Bring a Bat. Follow me, Uncle Dave, Dave Chemetsky, on Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, and Clubhouse. You can find all those links and more info at davidchemetsky.com. For show ideas, feedback, guest inquiries, or just a chat, reach out to me at peacelovebringabat@gmail.com. For sponsorship and media inquiries, reach out to peacelovebringabat@lp516.com. Make sure to follow all the great podcasts produced by Launchpad 516 Studios. Today's journey has come to a close, my friends. I hope the seeds of peace and love continue to grow for each one of you. Remember that peace and love surrounds you and will assist you to rise again. But don't forget to bring it back for what you believe in. Namaste.